and my paper was about universities, so higher education institutions, which were created for displaced persons, not only during the Cold War, but during the 20th and 21st century. 21st century. And Ruth Valint attended this workshop. She liked my topic, and due to her invitation, I became a research fellow at UNSW. So I am Hungarian. I was born in Hungary, and I did my PhD in history in France. My research topic was the Free Europe University in Exile that I would like to introduce during my talk. In the first part of my presentation, I will give an overview on the US strategy during the Cold War towards Europe and Eastern Europe. And I will also give a brief history of the Free Europe University in Exile. And in the second half of my presentation, I will explain how I discovered and I researched this very little known topic, what meant to do research on Eastern European dissidents in France in the 1980s and in the early 2000s. And at the very end, I will present my ongoing research, which focuses on universities in exile and the role of higher education in the context of forced displacement and also the current political situation in Europe. So to begin the presentation, to introduce the topic, what we need to discuss is not how the Cold War began, but why it began. It started because there was a fundamental ideological opposition between the United States and the Soviet Union, two great powers that emerged after the war. And here we can list the classical differences between the two countries. So liberal democracy with multi-party system versus people's democracy with centralized control of the Communist Party. Capitalism promoting private ownership, free markets and competition versus command economy with state ownership of resources and centralized economic planning. And finally, liberal democracy and human rights versus Marxism-Leninism, focusing on collective ownership and the idea of a classless society. So the United States perceived the Soviet Union as a threat to its own political, economic, and social system. The Soviet Union was a young state at the time, only 25 years old, but had gained prestige and international recognition for its efforts to defeat Nazi Germany and fascist military Japan. The Red Army was stationed all over Eastern Europe, where communist regime emerged from 1945 to 1949, and soon in Asia as well, while in Western Europe, communist parties gained electoral support, particularly in France and in Italy. So the United States needed to counter the threat posed by the Soviet Union to its own national interests at home and in the world, and to define a foreign policy that broke with the traditional isolationism. So to this end, the National Security Act was signed into law in 1947, which created a political strategic decision-making system that still exists in the US today. The act created many new institutions, amongst others the National Security Council and the Central Intelligence Agency. The National Security Council formulates and implements US foreign policy through national security directives, and the CIA gathers intelligence abroad to support decision-making on foreign policy. At the beginning of the Cold War, three global regions were identified as being of strategic importance to the United States, and that was Western Europe, Japan, and the Middle East. And the US government had a very important tool for fighting the Cold War. That was the National Security Directive 10/2, which authorized the US government to deploy covert operations in foreign countries, to plausibly deny responsibility for these operations, and especially if they fail, and to create a secret unit within the CIA to carry out these operations. That was the Office of Policy Coordination, created in 1949. And the blueprint for this directive was a paper that George Kennan drafted earlier that year. Kennan was an American diplomat, foreign policy strategist, and the father of the policy of containment. The inauguration of organized political warfare file was only declassified in 2005, and political warfare is a synonym for psychological warfare. And psychological warfare is all the covert action which is run by the US government. So in Western Europe, the first covert operations were used to have Christian Democrats win elections in Italy, and to create anti-communist trade unions in France to block the communist movement that strikes in the country. And after having successfully contained Soviet expansion in Western Europe, the United States turned its attention to Eastern Europe in 1949, where the strategy was to roll back communist power by liberating satellite countries from the Soviet Union and transforming them into liberal democracies. And in this strategy of liberation, the pivotal covert operation was the National Committee for Free Europe, which was designed to undermine Soviet power in Eastern Europe. It was established on 11 May 1949 in New York City as an American NGO, but secretly funded by the CIA. It was composed of the most influential men in US diplomacy and business at the time to give credibility to the committee's mission and to underline the importance of its work in the fight against communism. So all of its actions aimed at liberating the Iron Curtain countries. This was the overt mission of the committee. Only the involvement of the US government through the CIA funding was kept secret, because the fundamental ethical concern here was that while the US was overtly attacking the Soviet Union for interfering in the internal affairs of the satellite countries, the United States was secretly doing the same thing in Western Europe and then later on in Eastern Europe as well. So the committee launched 3 activities in 1950. The most important, effective, and enduring operation was the Radio Free Europe, which emitted news programs to satellite countries behind the Iron Curtain to counter Soviet propaganda. The headquarters was in Munich, in newly constructed buildings in the heart of the city, with press and documentation services. Secondly, the National Committee for Free Europe held political exiles to form a democratic representation of their countries in the free world. So these groups acted as pressure groups on international organizations, host governments, and their countries of origin. And finally, the Crusade for Freedom was launched as a nationwide fundraising campaign in the US to raise awareness of the communist danger in American society and to hide the secret funding of the CIA. So the National Committee for Free Europe started these activities in 1950, and in the following year, in 1951, it established the Free Europe University in Exile. It was the only additional activity it launched. This was because the university project wasn't the committee's idea. So Polish exiles in France gathered around the exile magazine Kultura, developed the idea of creating a university for Central and Eastern European refugees. Joseph Czapski and Jerzy Giedroyc were former soldiers who ended the war in Italy and started thinking about a university for Polish youth who refused to return to war-torn and communist-run Poland. However, the rapidly changing and deteriorating international relations changed their mind, and they developed the university project in 1947 into an academic institution open to all refugees coming from East European countries in order to save the intelligentsia of these countries from the destructive consequences of the Sovietization and to train a liberal democratic-minded, anti-communist and anti-nationalist elite in the hope of a lasting peace in Europe. And how did the university project make to become a real university sponsored by the world's most influential anti-communist organization? The answer is James Burnham, American philosopher, political strategist, and author of the world-famous Managerial Revolution, published in 1941, in which he predicted that society would evolve toward technocracy rather than capitalism or socialism. So how did Burnham meet the Polish exile? We have to go back to 1947. It was a crucial year, marking not only the beginning of the Cold War with the launch of the Marshall Plan, but also the emergence of anti-communist political forces in Western Europe. In France, a new political party was formed, led by the General Charles de Gaulle, which followed an openly anti-communist agenda. Politically speaking, it was an uneasy task because the Soviet Union had a stellar reputation due to its contribution to defeat the Axis powers, and particularly in France, the term anti-communist was disqualified as fascist at the time of the liberation. So what brought de Gaulle, Burnham, and the Polish exile together was their shared anti-communism. De Gaulle and other party officials already knew the Polish exile from the pre-war period. Meanwhile, intellectuals close to the Gaulle party took notice of James Burnham's work and edited his books in France. Burnham was even invited to the rallies of the Gaulle Party in France, and that was on this occasion in early 1948 that Burnham met Chapsky. And this meeting between the American intellectual and the Polish exile marked the beginning of the future university in exile, as Burnham became an ardent supporter of the university project. The story is even more interesting because the year after, in 1949, Burnham was secretly recruited into the Office of Policy, in the Office of Policy Coordination, so the secret unit within the CIA to conduct psychological warfare. Chapsky and Giedroyc were aware of Burnham's confidential links with the US government, thanks to which they met members of the Freedom Committee in New York City in 1950, and in the same year, the university project was officially presented at the first meeting of the Congress for Cultural Freedom in West Berlin in June 1950. And the launch of the Congress for Cultural Freedom was Burnham's chief contribution to the Cultural Cold War run by the CIA, because this Congress, this movement, was an intellectual transnational movement bringing together anti-totalitarian thinkers, scholars, journalists, artists from all around the world. So this was this dynamic development within the Cultural Cold War, and another project being developed at the same time by a concurrent American refugee organization that prompted the Freedom Committee to intervene quickly and to take over the university project. After 2 months of intensive negotiation in France between Freedom officials and the French authorities, the American committee was given a go-ahead in May 1951 to set up the study center in Strasbourg and to enroll its fellows at the University of Strasbourg, from which it had to operate on a strictly separate basis. The Polish exiles who played a fundamental role in the conception and the early development of the university project did not become members of the university in exile, nor were they involved in its work against the will and attempts of James Burnham. And now we arrive to the European University in exile. So what was it in a nutshell? Now we will weave through this information booklet together. So it was located in an 18th century old castle called Château de Portales in the eastern suburbs of Strasbourg. It was a US accredited educational institution which granted scholarship to exile students from Iron Curtain countries to follow studies of their choice at the University of Strasbourg. And as we can read the foreword somewhere in the middle, it says that the overtly political purpose of the institution was to equip the Freedom Fellows for future leadership in their native lands, which was in line with the covert US strategy of liberation. The university had a complicated organizational chart with 5 different entities for legal reasons. So first, the Freedom University in Exile was created in New York City as an educational corporation with prominent American scholars and members of the Freedom Committee. As we can see, James Burnham became a trustee.
Valentina speaking.
Second, a Western European representative was appointed to launch the operation in France on the legal side. Third, the Commission on Awards and Placement selected candidates. Fourth, a French legal entity was also created for operational and financial purposes. And finally, the heart of the whole operation was the study center in Strasbourg called Collège de l'Europe, Superior College. It was not by chance that the National Committee for Free Europe chose to create a study center in France and in the city of Strasbourg. It was not because the Polish exile began to explore the project in this country. France has a strategic interest in the post-war American foreign policy and national security, which wanted to make it an anti-communist bastion among Western European countries. Strasbourg was the headquarters of the newly formed Council of Europe, the first European intergovernmental organization to foster economic and political cooperation between Western countries. For this reason, the United States had a strategic interest in building close ties with the Council of Europe. Consequently, the Freedom University in Exile sought cooperation with both the Council of Europe and the Special Commission for European nations not represented in the Council of Europe, which brought the discussion of the Iron Curtain countries to the Council of Europe. Who was eligible for the Freedom Scholarship and what did it consist of? So the scholarship concerned university-age refugees from Iron Curtain countries who were already living in the West. So any explicit incitement to flee their countries were forbidden according to the agreement between Americans and the French. The scholarship covered the tuition fees for university students and accommodation at the Chateau de Portes. In return for the scholarship, the student had to fulfill two obligations: to successfully complete their university studies, and second, to attend the Figaro College own study program at the Chateau de Portes, which consisted of two separate programs. The first one was the so-called national seminars for each nationality represented at the Figaro College and taught by exiled tutors in their own language on the history and culture of these countries in order to keep alive in exile the national sentiment and the general knowledge of the students. And the second part of the study program was the summer university on contemporary political, economic, and social issues related not only to Eastern Europe, but to world politics, delivered by Western exiled political leaders, diplomats, scholars, journalists, and other professionals. So let me show you some statistics about the exiled students. There were about 200 students per year at the college, men and women, representing all 10 Iron Curtain countries. As you can see top left, the number of students by nationality per year. This number reflects not only the size of the population from which the national cohorts originally came from, but also the geographical proximity of these countries to the Western borders. So, for instance, there were more Czechoslovakian and Hungarian students than Bulgarian or Romanian, because these countries were closer to the West. Poland was the largest state among the satellite countries, so obviously provided the most refugee students at the college, while the small Baltic countries were generally represented by fewer students. The other statistics also show what the Figaro fellows were studying at universities. They were mainly enrolled at the University of Strasbourg, but many of them continued their studies at Western universities and later settled outside France or outside Europe, even in various positions. So the Figaro College was a public institution, like just its parent organization, the Figaro University in Exile in New York. The local newspapers regularly reported on the summer universities at the Chateau de Portes, which were open to the public. And the Figaro fellows were ordinary students who were enrolled at French universities or elsewhere. But covertly, the institution was in fact part of the US psychological warfare strategy to liberate the satellite states from the Soviet Union control. And let me show you some declassified documents now to prove the relationship between the Figaro University and the US government. So this file was declassified in 1994, and the Psychological Strategy Board was created in April 1951 to prepare operation plans in line with the National Security Council directives. During 1950-51, the issue of defectors, refugees, escapees, and their use in psychological warfare became increasingly important to American nationality security strategies. So the files proves that the Figaro University exile was involved in one of these operation plans with the mission of preparing an intellectual elite for the liberation of the Soviet bloc. And 2 years later, in 1953, on the initiative of the newly elected President U.E.B. Eisenhower, the American psychological warfare operations were reviewed. This document speaks for itself about the CIA's funding for the university exile, especially the last paragraph, if you can just see. This file was partially declassified in 2015, so in 2015. So up to this point, the Figaro University exile might seem like a success story, but it faced significant challenges during its brief existence. All these difficulties stemmed from one fundamental reality: the university was a psychological warfare operation run by the US government. So the first major crisis emerged in Strasbourg in 1953 because of the rushed establishment of the study center. Refugee students required extra classes to bridge educational gaps and improve their French, which led to debates among American and French officials about the Figaro College mission, whether to prepare students for life in Western world or emphasize anti-communist training. This disagreement involving personal conflict and divided groups of Americans, French, and exiles resulted in organized chaos reflecting the flaws in the US psychological warfare strategy. The turmoil nearly derailed the operation, coinciding with CIA plans to establish a second site in the Saar Basin, which was a former German territory under French protectorate. To stabilize the situation in Strasbourg, a wave of dismissals occurred, and from September 1953, the Free Europe College operated under new management, refocusing on university studies while enhancing its academic output. From 1954, however, the new management had to face another challenge, the enduring Cold War and the advent of peaceful coexistence. This meant that practically no refugees arrived from behind the Iron Curtain, and the number of applicants fell dramatically. For these reasons, the Board of Trustees in New York decided, not without regret, to change the operation of the university from a boarding school to a scholarship granting institution, giving Free Europe Fellows the freedom to choose their place of study in Western Europe. Their only obligation remained to attend the summer university, which continued on the same basis, so lecture given by exiled and Western personalities, with an additional program designed to keep the cohorts of the Free Europe Fellows in the free world together, to make them aware of the danger of communism, and to engage them into anti-communist activism. And the last challenge that the Free Europe College had to deal with was the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 and its consequences. So the revolution broke out on 23rd October and was crushed by the Soviet military intervention on 12th November, which was immediately discussed in the United Nations Security Council. At the same time, the Soviet Union attacked the Free Europe Radio and the United Nations for intervening in the internal affairs of people's democracies to overthrow communist governments. The consequences of the failed revolution against communist rule were immediately felt. It meant the consolidation of Soviet power behind the Iron Curtain and the evaporation of any hope of liberating the satellite countries in the foreseeable future. Consequently, American psychological warfare operations were reviewed, including the activities of the Free Europe Committee. Radio Free Europe was by far the most successful and effective asset, and it was unquestionable that the operation should be discontinued. But that was not the case with the Free Europe University in exile. Apart from operational and staffing issues, the CIA adopted the psychological warfare effectiveness of the Free Europe College, which was a very costly operation. We have to talk about roughly $1 million at the time, just to fund the university. Senior American officials of the university in exile wanted to continue the operation as a separate and independent academic institution focusing on Eastern Europe. But the CIA refused to fund a purely academic operation unless it met US strategic interests. This was rejected by the senior officials, who voted in 1958 to phase out the university in exile. It was an extremely difficult decision to take, especially after the Hungarian Revolution, when the US was attacked for abandoning the Iron Curtain countries to their fate despite its promises. However, the most delicate task during this process was managing public communication about the closure, which was decided under classified psychological warfare consideration. We can read the excerpt of the official announcement on the closure, and we see that the purpose of the institution was retroactively changed and adjusted to the status quo in Eastern Europe in 1958. So the announcement says that the university in exile was created to have a special cohort of young refugees, those displaced by World War II and the communist takeover. And now I will quote the announcement. It was recognized at the time that this project by its nature would continue only for a relatively few years. After 7 years, these young people already completed their studies or reached adult life. It is proper now to announce the termination of this project. Quotation ends. This is how the story of the Free Europe University exile and the Free Europe College ended, despite years of overt and covert commitment to training a future intellectual elite in the event of the collapse of the communist regimes behind the Iron Curtain. However, only 2 years later, the Free Europe Committee relaunched the Summer University in Strasbourg to keep together the cohort of nearly 1,000 Free Europe alumni. The Free Europe Summer University in the 1960s followed the same mission as in the 1950s to influence future leaders, but the target group changed. So it attempted not only to educate Eastern European refugees living in the West, but third world students from Africa, Asia, and Latin America who were studying in Europe, and also East European communist students coming directly from the Iron Curtain countries to attend the summer university. So while the history of the Free Europe University in Exile in the 1950s offers reflections on the dynamics of the Cold War between East and West, the Free Europe summer sessions in the 1960s highlight the broader context of the global Cold War. But these summer sessions were short-lived, and the Free Europe Committee closed its European operations in 1965, with the sole exception of the Radio Free Europe. 2 years later, in 1967, a scandal erupted in the US over the CIA secret funding on American NGOs and revealed that the agency had covertly financed various organizations at home and abroad as part of the American Cold War strategy. It was argued that the US government had violated basic democratic principles such as freedom and transparency while fighting the Soviet Union. The Free Europe Committee and Radio Free Europe were also caught up in the scandal. Only Radio Free Europe survived, able to continue its broadcasts to unfree societies thanks to US Congress approved funding. When the scandal broke out in 1967, Thomas Braden, pictured, who was former director of the CIA's unit, which provided secret funding to American NGOs at home and abroad, published an article praising the agency's work. He was glad to be immoral and to fight communism through covert action because, as he said, it was part of the Cold War, and also because the amount of money the CIA provided to domestic and international anti-communist NGOs was far less than the Soviet Union spent on propaganda. By the way, Thomas Braden came to visit the Free Europe College in Strasbourg in 1952. So the Cold War continued until the late 1980s, and now I am just shifting to the second part of the presentation if we have enough of time. So the Cold War continued until the late 1980s, when the first books came out on the early years of the CIA in English scholarship, so including books on the Radio Free Europe. But nothing was written about the Free Europe University in Exile, no printed materials from Free Europe, and no mention in history books, neither in English nor in French, as if it had never existed. Apart from the fact that the archives were not yet open to research and were scattered all over the world, another reason for this silence is that academic research on the history of Eastern European dissidents has long been ignored in France for political reasons. Antoine Marès, a French history professor, was the first to take up the issue in 1996, explaining that France's long-standing devotion to socialism, which dates back to the 19th century, the 14 years of the socialist François Mitterrand presidency until 1995, and third, more generally, the left-wing orientation of French intellectuals had neglected the study of Eastern European dissidents, which they saw as delegitimizing their own political convictions. I discovered the topic on the Free Europe University in Exile during my master's studies in Paris in a book on the history of immigration in France. And the book contained only these two sentences on the college without any footnote or reference. Two seminar works on cultural Cold War also ignored the topic, with only a few brief mention in Pierre Grémion's book on the intellectual history of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. So the aim of my research was to find the maximum number of sources to write the history of the Free Europe University exile, and to find out if the Free Europe College was indeed secretly part of the US liberation strategy run by the CIA. I did extensive research in Europe, in France, Poland, Hungary, and Switzerland, and in the US as well, in 3 presidential libraries and archives, and also in the Cuban institution, which holds the collection of the Radio Free Europe. My research was fortunate enough to coincide with the opening up of access to primary sources. So, for example, the Radio Free Europe collection at the Huber Institution was only opened to research in 2004, and I started my research in 2007, 2008 at that time. The most interesting part of the research was meeting Free Europe fellows, staff members, and their relatives. I recorded about 15 audiovisual interviews and gained access to their private archives, including various written materials and photographs as well. So just to explain the pictures which are on the slide, top left, the two photos, this is the former building of the Radio Free Europe, which is in Munich. Now the building belongs to the Technology University of Munich. So it's running as a university building and a library. And when I was just completing the PhD, just writing, I was able to work in the library. And the picture on the right, this is the building of the Château de Courtauld. So that was the headquarters of the Free Europe College. Today it's run like, it's a hotel today. I launched also a research group, University Exile Research Project, which is not only dedicated to my doctoral studies, but mostly to my ongoing research, which I hope have some time to introduce you at the end. And just to tell you that I was sometimes interviewed as well in France during my studies. And two authors are very much inspired about this Free Europe College run by the CIA. And the two books just came out. So they are fiction books, but about the college in 2024 and 2025. So they are brand new. Living in Australia, I was able to meet in person the only Free Europe fellow who had immigrated to Australia in 1956. Ivan Barko made a lifelong career as a lecturer in French literature and language at the University of Newcastle, the University of Melbourne, Monash University, and from 1976 to 1919, he had the McCovey Chair of French at the University of Sydney, where on his retirement, he was appointed Emeritus Professor. We've been in touch via internet for 15 years, and he's following the presentation here from Sydney. Ivan Barko reminded me that another young Polish refugee who had lectured at the Free Europe College Summer University in 1955 also emigrated to Australia and went on to a distinguished career. This Polish refugee was Jerzy Zubrycki, the father of Australian multiculturalism, who played a pivotal role in shaping Australian multicultural policies. And finally, I'm privileged to be in contact with the grandson of the Western European representative of the Free Europe Committee. Royal Tyler was responsible for setting up the university in exile in France and negotiating with the French authorities to this end. Royal Tyler, who shares his grandfather's names, lives in New South Wales, and he's a former professor of Japanese literature and former director of the Japanese Center at the National University of Australia. My current work consists of publishing the PhD and advancing my postdoctoral research, and now I am just watching if it's good. So I would like to introduce to you very quickly my postdoctoral research plan, but I can follow now as an adjunct fellow at UNSW. My postdoctoral project focuses on universities exile in Europe in the 20th and in the 21st century. Using the example of the Free Europe University in exile, I was interested in educational initiatives that enable displaced academics to continue the teaching and research activities on learning in exile. The aim of this research is to raise awareness of the destructive consequences of post-migration on higher education, which has affected and continues to affect nation-state, minorities, ethnic groups, and their cultures all around the world. And I'm also looking for solutions to save the intellectual capital of these affected populations. So that was the research project that I presented at the Calder Center workshop. And I will just show you some examples for university in exile. So the first university in exile was created in 1933 at the university. Well, it's a higher education institution, but at the New School for Social Research, which is in New York. And this university in exile granted not very much fellowship, but it was hosting exiled academics from Germany who left because of Hitler power seizure, and because they were mostly Jewish and political enemies of the Nazi Germany. By the way, the name of the university in exile, so that was in the New York. This one is inspired the name of the Free Europe University in exile. Previously, in 1921, an Ukrainian Free University was created in Vienna. Then it was relocated to Prague, and in 1945 it was relocated again to Munich, but it still existed as a private university. And this university also hosts Ukrainian academics and students, and it has a special program just dedicated to Ukrainian studies. It's very interesting to note that the Free Europe University in exile, as I just mentioned, it was phased out in 1958, but the idea to create a liberal-minded and anti-communist intellectual elite was finally came back at the end of the Cold War, and that was the reasoning to fund the Central European University by the Hungarian former refugee and philanthropist businessman George Soros. The Central European University had to relocate its activity in 2019 to Vienna because it was expelled for political reasons from Hungary. And this attack on academic freedom made to relaunch the new school, University in Exile, which now hosts exiles, scholars in American universities. And when the war against Ukraine started, the Central European University created the Invisible University for Ukraine, which again gives dedicated program on Ukraine for Ukrainian students, including Ukrainian scholars. So that was one part of the project, just to find other educational initiative for displaced person. And very recently, I just participated in another conference at the University of Copenhagen. I attended, so I wasn't there physically, but I presented my research, and I just developed further this project of University in Exiles. And I am thinking about that we can talk about in two different contexts about University in Exiles. So one perspective of this phenomenon is universities which were funded for forcibly displaced scholars and students. And again, in this group, there are two different kinds of universities for displaced scholars. There are the ones who are created in a sign of solidarity, so just to have people to continue their teaching and learning activities at universities. So the most obvious examples, University in Exile created in New York in 1953. The Academy in Exile was created in Germany in 2017. The New Schools, New University in Exile Consortium was created in 2018. And in France, a University in Exile was also opened in November 2023. So these academic structures enable exiled teachers, scholars to continue their research. And the other group of universities in exile for displaced person is the one who had a distinct academic educational program, and they act as a counter university to set up a substitute higher education institution in exile. So this is the example of the Ukrainian Free University, Free Europe University Exile, and the Invisible University of Ukraine. And there is another context in which we can talk about university in exile, and these are the displaced universities who had to relocate their campus due to political pressure, and also the counter universities which are created in their place. I don't know if you heard about the European Humanities University. I just have to find my paper to quote the date when it was founded. The European Humanities University was founded in Minsk, in Belarus in 1992, but had to relocate its campus to Lithuania in 2004 under the pretext of a legal issue. But again, the idea was that to expel liberal academic institution in a post-communist country. The Central European Universities case that I mentioned before, it just happened some years ago. So in 2017, there was a change in the Hungarian higher educational law, which affected all foreign operating universities in Hungary. But the amendment and the reluctance of the Hungarian government to find an agreement made it impossible for the Central European University to continue its operation in Budapest, and the university had to relocate its campus to Vienna in 2019. And also, I just quoted a third exam from Russia. The Hornyik College, it's a project. It started in 1997 between St. Petersburg State University and Bard College in New York. And it became one of the most important Russian-American partnership in higher education. In 2021, the Bard College was designated as undesirable organization by Russian authorities, claiming that the study program was carried out with the help of foreign NGOs affiliated with George Soros, and it was conducting destructive activities within the federation. So these are the universities. There are many examples, but the most important, just for the presentation, which had to relocate their campus outside the country. So they are in exile due to political pressure. And I just show also examples to the country universities which are created in their place. For example, the Matthias Corvinus Collegium in Hungary, which is the most important and the most influential Hungarian higher education institution next to public funding. It's also buying now campuses in Austria, in Vienna, so it's expanding. The Polish University Collegium Intermarium is following the same path, is also the part of the network of these populist nationalist universities which are in the making. In France, there is also an institution, Institute of Social, Economic and Political Sciences, which is created by the French right-wing politician Marion Maréchal in 2018. And finally, which is in the making now, Steve Bannon, who is the political strategist, ex-political strategist of President Donald Trump, he's also considering to create university. It's already started in Italy 5 years ago, but there was an issue with the rental lease of the monastery where he wanted to create his university, this gladiator school for Western culture, for Western cultural studies. And now he's looking for a new location, and probably it will be in Hungary. So just the final word, why is it just a reflection on the creation of these populist universities in Europe, which shows, of course, the emergence of populist nationalist anti-European political forces. What is interesting here to see that we are exactly in the same dynamics than after the Cold War, and all these anti-communist political forces, which was, I explained, it was absolutely an unorthodox strategy and political idea at the time. These nationalist populist forces, they are just emerging at national levels, and definitely the universities, this network of universities, will have them to really to create a global network of the new right around the world. And just a last thought about all of this, that while we are talking about the emergence of populist universities in Europe and about political, populist, nationalist, and anti-European political forces, it's also a reckoning with actors, institutions, and methods heritage from the Cold War. So methods, I mean, foreign interference abroad in the internal affairs of foreign states, or institutions like the Radio Free Europe. I don't know if you're following the news, but the Radio Free Europe is still exists, so it's broadcasting to unpaid societies. And some weeks ago, the Trump administration wanted to cut the funding of the Radio Free Europe. Now it was attacked by the officials of the Radio Free Europe, and hopefully, if they wasn't able to come the funds. But what is happening now, it's really a reckoning. All these institutions, methods, actors, American NGOs, just to have to forge and to emerge this populist, nationalist, anti-European new right. And I just showed this example on the right because this new right, the bastion of this new right in Europe is in Hungary now. And it's a very interesting comparison again that during the Cold War, the United States chose France as a bastion to advance his strategic aims. But now in the present time, the United States, under the President Trump, wants to push this MAGA movement, this nationalist populist movement. And now the bastion of this politics is in Hungary. And what is the new right? So what it stands for? It stands for national sovereignty, traditional societal norms, anti-migration, anti-gender, and anti-European political agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronika, for that fascinating talk and insight into really original and important research. I'd like to open it up for questions now. Yes, David, and yep, okay. First, the other, Lava, and then David Reed.
Oh, me, okay.
And then Nick, was it you?
Leo.
Yes.
First of all, sorry for all my comings and goings. Just a question about the, if you like, the political complexion of the students in the first the European Free University, pure university and stuff. I mean, they were anti-communist. Obviously, that can describe a lot of different things. And I guess the tendency is to kind of think of a sort of identikit centre right, maybe a bit more right than centre right, sort of virulently, sort of not just anti-communist but anti-socialist. But is there any justification for that kind of stereotype, or is it a much more complex and nuanced picture of the student?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Very true. You have to know that it was very hard already to find archives on the field of university in exile. And when I went through the archives, I understood that even the files on the students was classified and is still classified. So we don't really know who are the students. We have just numbers. As I mentioned, I was able to meet one of them. I interviewed them, but definitely the topic comes up. So I mean that there are the ones who were better central right, the ones who were leftish. And there are some indication that among the Romanian students, maybe there was some previous fascist students as well. So there are some archives on it, definitely. In the PhD, I was much not interested, but as I mentioned, there was nothing written on the university. So my first aim was to write the institutional history of the university in exile. And the second aim would be to work a little bit on the students. Who were the students? But it's very hard to find information. But definitely a very good question because, well, Eastern Europe, it was a very, very diverse region.
No, wait, yeah, it's David.
Was he one of the students or?
Yes, he was one of the students. Yeah, he was a Europe fellow. He was in Belgium before, so he studied in French literature at the University of Louvain, so in Brussels, and he immigrated to Australia in 1956, just before the revolution, 3 months before the revolution, accidentally. Yeah.
David?
What a wonderful European story, thank you. My background is in Asian studies, and the Congress for Cultural Freedom was very active in a lot of Asian countries. And I wondered if you ever come across any sort of mirror institution as part of the CIA and Congress for Cultural Freedom Asian strategy.
Yeah, not really on the 1950s, but when I mentioned in the PhD that the National Committee for Free Europe, it has a president, Joseph Krug. Maybe they know it is something. He was ambassador of the United States in Japan just before the war and during the first years of the Second World War. And he was the president of the Free Europe Committee. And when the committee created the Free of University Exile, Joseph grew as a person. He was the president of a foundation to fund the International Japanese University, which is a still existing university. So the aim was the same, just to educate these Japanese students, not to keep them also on the liberal democratic line, which was in line with the US strategy. This is the only exam that I can give you about Asia. Yeah, the 1960s, so the period of summer sessions, I did not talk about in my PhD because as I mentioned, it's really another dynamic. So the PhD is just about the period of university exam, about this 7 years, but the global world war will come soon after. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, again, thanks for this fascinating talk. So originally I have something really similar to David about the Asian connections, but now, yeah, I'll ask another question. It's about these exile university idea, because as you have shown, there are precedents of exile academic in America from Europe already. So was there any discussion in the archive that have the policymaker in CIA or in other part of the story that's trying to think about whether to create another institution in the US rather than the Europe to nurture these, exile scholars?
So in the 1950s, when the Freedom Committee took over this idea to build a university, they definitely wanted to do it in Europe because they just felt that if the students they are in the United States, they will never come back to the Iron Curtain later on when the Soviet regime collapsed to introduce democracy. So they definitely wanted to create it in Europe. And France was an obvious choice because the American officials has the best relationship with these people, with these French diplomats, which also go back to a little bit to the Second World War. So all these relations which were forged during resistance, during World War II, and it helped a lot actually that to the freedom officials to create university in France. In Western Germany, it was just not possible. Well, that was under joint territory at the beginning. There was the most refugees there, by the way. So the proximity of Strasbourg, which is very close to the German border, it made also very easy to recruit students to submit for the applications.
That's my question actually, and then is how, obviously this is a period when the displaced persons camps in Germany and Austria are shutting down, and young refugees seeing the university as a pathway for a visa to the West. I just wondered if you know whether that might have been.
What I read in the archives, that definitely the most publicity was in exile, journals, camps, definitely too. I also have a very nice flyer, a very big poster in the archives, just about everything on the field of university exile. And definitely they explain that the scholarship can help them to rebuild their life in the West. So yeah, but it's also interesting that I thought that the French official explicitly bans any incitement that these students flee their countries because they just didn't want to be embarrassed, by a flow of migrants who were coming from Iron Curtain countries, and also because it was very dangerous because, the Iron Curtain was very much controlled by armies and policemen.
A question from Stephen, a question online, and are there any other questions just while we'll start with Stephen? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Veronika. Really fascinating talk. So rich with so many layers. I wanted to pick up on the question of the host country, France, and you talked about the fact that the French self-image tended to be perhaps a little more leaning socialist and sympathetic to the Soviet Union, given the recent experience of World War II. So I'm curious to know if in your research you've picked up on any kind of press discussion or opposition within France to this somewhat shady or kind of somewhat interesting institution on French soil, which is very, very connected to America. And also, I suppose, I'm curious to know who's teaching there. I mean, is the program in English or is it in French? And have you had a chance to look closely at the curricula? Because it looked fairly innocuous from that list, you know, literature, engineering and so on. So I'm wondering at what level this kind of pro or anti-communist indoctrination, if we can call it that, is feeding into the educational experience.
Sure. Just talking about France, what's interesting, there are many documents on the negotiation between Europe officials and French diplomats, but in the same time, it was kept really at a low profile in the news. That was also a kind of, you know, secret agreement. It was not secret agreement, but it was definitely, I mean, in local newspaper in Alsace and in Strasbourg, after a certain time, there were some articles about the fear of college. But at the time, it was a very crucial moment in French politics. 1950-58, that was the height of the communist forces in France. So that was an agreement to keep this profile very low. There were some articles, and the French communists also, they not protested. There were some articles in the Humanité, which is was the French communist propaganda newspaper. But finally, at the end of the day, they didn't have really trouble with the communists. So the Freedom of University I had never really was embarrassed during this existence. And the curriculum, very nice, very good questions. So the institutional archives of the Freedom of University in Exile in America, in the United States, it's much more about the organization and much more on the relationship between the university and the US government agencies. But in France, we can find archives, primary sources about the curriculum and about the lecturers as well. It's also a very interesting history, because the most important collection on the curriculum of the field of University Exile is in the private archives of a Polish exile teacher who was recruited in 1952 to teach the exile group of Polish students. And he worked until the end at the field of college. And when he died, well, his paper was just left behind, you know, boxes of papers. And the family deposited all the archives to the Polish Library of Paris in the early 90s. So thanks to the family, finally, that we can study the curriculum of the field of University Exile. And they were definitely the most important last time, you know, personalities, I mean, really diplomats, not first-line diplomats, you know, but among scholars, definitely economic teachers. So it was not just about the political situation, but it was about economic and social issues as well. And not only French and Americans, but exiled scholars as well, and many Germans, later on Italian, Spanish, and also some Latin American diplomats as well. So at the time, it was a very important intellectual gathering. And it was also, you know, a kind of way to binding ties between anti-communist Western and exiled intellectuals. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we have a question from our colleague, Andrew Beattie, who says that you mentioned some students ending up in Australia, but are you aware of any who returned to their countries of origin, or of any security concerns about double agents or spies or so-called fake exiles, possibly more likely in the activities in the 1960s?
Yeah, so the former field of fellows I've met, they all stayed in Western European countries, so nobody returned back. But during my PhD studies, I made some research in Hungarian secret service archives and in Polish archives as well. And we know from the American archives that all the students who came to the college were cleared. So I mean that, you know, there was some process about that, if they were communists before or not. So they were all cleared. And when the Hungarian Revolution broke out, 1956, it was like kind of, you know, size in the international relationship. So there were there was a big flow of refugees So that was a moment for the Hungarian Secret Services to send some agents as well. And among these 56 refugee students, there are some agents who then sent and wrote reports about the Freedom College, and which was just reported back to the Hungarian secret policies. That was the same with the Polish exercise as well. But the Hungarian Revolution, it was really, you have to imagine it was a really important event at the time because of the Iron Curtain. There was definitely no refugees who could just cross the border. But it's an important thing to understand that it was really an independent and academic institution. So the funding, of course, came from the CIA, but we just saw also this declassified file from 1994, which proved the aim was to really to create an intellectual elite. So the funding again was the CIA, but it was the Cold War.
Yes.
Thanks a lot. That was great. I wonder if there were any publications linked to the university, the student journals, or any publications coming out of it. And I've got, I work on Middle Eastern book history, so I've got Franklin book program at the back of my mind. Can you tell us if there was something along these lines?
Yeah. So what I understood from the story, from history of the field of university design, that it was really like it was a very ambitious plan. So they just set up it very quickly because they wanted to do something very big, because it was a great idea, and all the Free Europe officials, kind of intelligence officials liked very much the idea, but they unfortunately couldn't spend so much time on the intellectual, side, on the academic output of the university. It started coming in the mid-50s. There was a small group of the advanced students group. So they started doing some works, on Eastern European countries. And also the university had a kind of intern. So it was a kind of, I would say not newspaper, but dedicated studies to dedicated issues. So like higher education behind the Iron Curtains and whatever. But it was a very ambitious undertaking. And I wouldn't say that without academic output, but they didn't really have the time to develop something more profound, for long term.
Are there any more questions for Veronika?
Rather than asking entries, you mentioned that your favorite part of the research was the interviews that you undertook. Even though you've written an institutional history, I was wondering if you could give us perhaps some of the insight of what you got from those interviews.
Yeah, I was really fortunate because, well, look, it's dates from the 1950s, and now we are in 2025. So already just if we make a little calculation between the time when it was opened, and the most I interviewed so many people, I met so many people, and nobody told me now. So I mean that I was never rejected. Everybody was open to talk about it. I think really, as I mentioned, the French history professor remarks, about that these people were really a little bit forgotten, during the 1980s and 1990s. And they were really, they were a little bit, they were just so happy that finally somebody arrives and they ask questions about how was it, how did they do, how they, flee their countries at the time, how dangerous was it, and how they could just find the freedom fellowship and how it was to be there. And at the very end, when I asked the question, and did you know that? Everybody's like, yeah, well, retrospectively we understood, but we were all anti-communist at that time. So we were very happy to be there, and we went there because it was an anti-communist university, and we were in line actually with the vision. And it's also, I think, we are all historians, but when we work on a topic which is really the early Cold War, nobody ever, even the American officials, thought that it would be a lasting, an enduring Cold War. I mean, even the university, when preparing or forming a future elite, nobody, thought of in decades. I mean, that they thought that in 3 or 4 years, these students really will be able to go back behind the Iron Curtain to introduce liberal democracy instead of people's democracy. Yeah, and also, not just met pre-doc fellows, but staff members as well. And they had very interesting private archives, which enabled me to study the CIA link with the university. Because, well, I don't know if somebody is doing research on Cold War, but there's the Freedom Information Act, which dates from 1994. So everybody, every researcher, even private person can apply to the CIA to declassify documents. I also sent my inquiry, and finally I just get one report that was already available in the archive. So finally it couldn't really help me to prove the link within the CIA and university exams. But in private archives, there were some very interesting materials on it. Yeah.
Let's all put our hands together.
And if I can, I would like just to thank you, well, to you as well, that you followed my presentation, but to all the people, former fellows, staff members, and their relatives who shared with me their stories, their materials, because it's not an easy topic. It was an easy topic at the 1950s. It was not an easy topic just after the political changes in the 1990s. And even today, again, it's a backlash. So thank you so much for that. Thank you.